Putin's illegal, unprovoked, and premeditated war is not just an attack on Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, as horrible as that is. It also takes aim at the very heart of the rules-based international order, forged after the Second World War had rained destruction across Europe.
We must continue our pressure on Moscow, our support for Ukraine, and we must strengthen our resilience at home. Because in the end, this is what protecting a free Europe means in practice.
This is not just our fight. This is the battle for the foundational values of the free world. This is the battle for who gets to dictate the new world order. Is it the tyrants or is it democracies?
Hello, everyone. I am Geisha Gonzalez, and I'm the Senior Vice President at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. On behalf of myself and the entire team here at CEPA, welcome to Day 2 of CEPA Forum, Meeting the Moment, Allies at a Crossroads. We'd like to thank our partners for this year's forum, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Mercedes-Benz, Leviathan, and Google. A special thank you to our partners, the embassies of Czechia, Slovakia, and Romania, as well as News Strategy Center. And to our media partners, Euractiv, Defense One, and Politico. Thank you so much for joining us at this year's forum. And now for a special message from our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova.
Hello and welcome to Day 2 of CEPA Forum 2022, Meeting the Moment, Allies at a Crossroads. I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA. Yesterday, we heard from leading voices from across government, civil society, and the military, who overwhelmingly agreed that the future of European security and our own democracies is being fought for in Ukraine. Today, we turn our focus on how democracies are fighting back using our own democratic toolkit, from sanctions to diplomacy to supporting democracy fighters across the globe. On this day last year, our discussions recognized the bravery of democracy advocates against authoritarianism all over the world, a struggle that has spanned from Belarus and Moldova to Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Many of these challenges remain today, including Russian aggression, China's malign influence, the global spread of disinformation. This year, however, we are offered the opportunity to recognize and be truly inspired by Ukraine's remarkable resilience. Not just the resilience of Ukraine's military, but also, and even more crucially, the resilience of Ukraine's society, the Ukrainian state, and the Ukrainian spirit. As a transatlantic community of democracies, we must learn from Ukraine's resilience. We must bolster it, and we must support them in their fight. Their victory will be our victory. In the long term, oppression will not prevail over freedom. Authoritarianism will not win. But in the short term, we have a long fight ahead. As Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of Democratic Belarus, said at last year's CEPA Forum, freedom is not a bargaining chip. We must remain brave and united. This call to action could not be more relevant today. It is clear that we can no longer take our democratic future for granted. While authoritarians continue to push, trying to take us down, we have shown, with Ukraine leading the way, that we are not and will not be out of this fight. In today's discussions, emerging leaders, thinkers, and decision makers will explore the challenges facing the future of all of our democracies and the steps we need to take to fare through these uncertain waters. Please be sure, as always, to follow these exciting conversations on the CEPA website at cepa.org and across all our social media using the hashtag #MeetTheMoment. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, Alina. It is now my honor to welcome President Zuzana Chaputova of the Republic of Slovakia to welcome us on this day, the Day of Democratic Resilience. Over to you, Madam President.
Ladies and gentlemen, the debate on protecting a free Europe is no longer an academic exercise. It's a practical necessity. Europe is facing an aggressive war by Vladimir Putin on Ukraine and our rules-based security order. We also struggle to address the flood of disinformation that divide our societies and undermine our ability to act. To protect a free Europe, we must deal with both of these challenges. Ukraine is at the center of Putin's war and his dangerous conviction that some countries are more equal than others. Russia's aggression has already killed thousands and displaced millions. But his threats aren't limited to Ukraine. In December 2021, Russia demanded a veto over allied forces in Central and Eastern Europe. This would turn the countries on NATO's eastern flank, including my own Slovakia, into second-class allies. It would destroy the security which has ensured prosperity and peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. In historic moments like this, clarity and action matter. We have shown both. From day one, most countries in Central and Eastern Europe knew what was needed. We supported the victim, not the aggressor. We have been welcoming the Ukrainians fleeing the war and supporting our neighbor. And as many other allies, including the United States, we also provide military aid so Ukraine can defend itself. Many of us in Europe are approaching this task while facing difficult situation at home, mostly because of high inflation. There is also a growing confusion and fragmentation in our societies, further deepened by disinformation and propaganda, amplified via social media platforms. While supporting Ukraine, we must also strengthen our economies and societies, because the weak can't help the others. Europe and the US must also increase cooperation to adopt democratic rules to regulate social media and online space. I welcome recent EU steps in this direction. We draw encouragement from the bravery of the Ukrainians and their recent successes. Neither they nor we will give in to Putin's nuclear blackmail or accept his shame referenda. We must continue our pressure on Moscow, our support for Ukraine, and we must strengthen our resilience at home. Because in the end, this is what protecting a free Europe means in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. At CEPA, our core mission is to ensure a strong and enduring transatlantic alliance rooted in democratic values and principles. That is why we are so honored to welcome our following speakers: Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and Secretary General Stefano Sannino of the European External Action Service. Over to you.
Hello, and thank you to Dr. Alina Polyakova and the Center of European Policy Analysis for inviting me to speak today. It is my distinct pleasure to speak alongside so many distinguished leaders from both sides of the Atlantic. Russian President Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine remains one of the foremost security challenges facing Europe today. Putin's illegal, unprovoked, and premeditated war is not just an attack on Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, as horrible as that is. It also takes aim at the very heart of the rules-based international order, forged after the Second World War had rained destruction across Europe. No country has the right to change another country's borders by force, or to determine that country's political future on its own, or to dictate the terms of its alliances and partnerships. And yet that is exactly what Putin has said he believes he has the right to do in Ukraine. One thing is certain: the Ukrainian people have a very different view. Since February, we have seen Ukrainians from all walks of life perform incredible acts of heroism. We have seen residents of villages and small towns alter road signs to confuse and demoralize the invading army. We have seen teachers and students volunteer as ambulance drivers and medics to heal the wounded. And we have seen so much more. Because the Ukrainian people see no other choice. They know the stakes, and they are fighting every day to be free in their own country. When we talk about this war, we must acknowledge the sacrifice of the Ukrainian people. Families torn apart, thousands killed and wounded, millions forced to flee their homes and start new lives, so much needless violence and tragedy. And why? All because President Putin was determined to conquer another country, a sovereign country with its own rich history and language and culture, a country that has proudly celebrated its independence from Moscow, not just this year, but every year since 1991. Tragically, the longer the Kremlin's war drags on, the more it resorts to brutality. And the latest accounts are truly chilling. We know Russian officials and proxy authorities in Russia-controlled areas of Ukraine are systematically forcing population transfers in violation of the Geneva Convention. We know they have compelled more than 1 million Ukrainian citizens, including 260,000 children, to leave their homes and move to Russia. Children. Some of them are being, quote, re-educated, unquote. Others will be forced to live with Russian families thousands of miles from home, with no way of knowing what happened to their real families. But we know these tactics will backfire. Ukraine will remain independent, and its people will fight harder than ever for their freedom. So what is our role? Not only as friends of Ukraine, but also as partners committed to the rules-based international order? How can we meet this moment? I want to talk about 3 ways. First, we will continue to support Ukraine and the aspirations of its people. Second, we will hold Russia accountable for its abuses and work to ensure this war is a strategic failure for Putin. And finally, we will deepen our commitment to the Transatlantic alliance so we can emerge from this crisis stronger and even more united. The world has stood with Ukraine. The international community has provided and pledged historic amounts of assistance, more than $24 billion so far. Since the start of the Biden-Harris administration, the United States alone has committed over $15 billion to Ukraine in humanitarian assistance, military assistance, economic assistance, and more. And we've done all of this in close coordination with Ukraine, with our European allies and partners, and with allies and partners around the world. This unprecedented diplomatic coordination and unprecedented assistance has helped Ukraine resist Russia's aggression and fight back effectively against Russian forces from Kyiv to Kharkiv to Kherson. The United States is resolved to continue supporting Ukraine and Europe in its self-defense. That is why Secretary Blinken traveled to Kyiv earlier this month, his third trip to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, and announced $2 billion more in security assistance to Ukraine and 18 other European countries. Our commitment to Ukraine is deep, it's bipartisan, and it reflects broad U.S. support. That commitment extends to Ukraine's most vulnerable citizens. Since the start of the war, more than a quarter of Ukraine's population has been forced to flee their homes. In response, countries around the world have taken extraordinary steps to help those in need. The United States has supplied life-saving humanitarian assistance, including food, water, shelter, and health care. And we commend our European allies and partners who have welcomed large numbers of Ukrainians fleeing the war, granting them the ability to work and access housing and health care in their countries. And we'll continue to work together on these issues because this is who we are. These are our values in action. We'll also continue to impose costs on the Kremlin for its actions. Since February, the United States and our European allies and partners have joined together in unprecedented ways. Nearly 40 countries, including the United States, the full G7, and the European Union, have delivered round after round of targeted sanctions on Russia and on those who enable its aggression. Make no mistake, the sanctions are biting. Russia's GDP has shrunk significantly. Export controls have disrupted supply lines. Russia's industrial production is at a standstill. Its credit ratings have been downgraded, and it has lost tens of thousands of skilled knowledge workers. While the Kremlin continues to withhold key economic indicators that tell the full story, Russia's economic prospects are bleak. And they will be for as long as Putin continues to wage war against Ukraine. War does untold damage to families, to communities, to societies, and this one is no exception. War also shows us why self-defense is so important. And in NATO, we have the greatest defensive alliance the world has ever known. NATO is critical for peace in Europe, and it exists to protect nations large and small. That's why we're looking forward to our close partners, Sweden and Finland, joining NATO soon. Last month, President Biden signed their accession protocols after the Senate approved them overwhelmingly in a bipartisan vote. We appreciate the swift action of all allies who have already ratified the accession protocols, and we encourage all others to complete the process as soon as possible. Because when we formally welcome Sweden and Finland into NATO, the world will become more peaceful and more secure. This war has also lifted the veil on the Kremlin's energy policies. In Putin's Russia, natural gas is just another weapon, a political and economic tool to try to bend others to its will, a weapon that Putin has used to leave Europeans in the cold in the dead of winter. There is no doubt Russia's coercion has put pressure on energy markets, raised prices, and threatened global energy security. And sadly, the Kremlin chooses to use energy to try to sow divisions between allies and within countries. But these tactics are backfiring. They are pushing countries to dramatically reduce their Russian imports, to seek new suppliers, and to invest in clean energy alternatives for the future. Because it's simple. When we reduce our reliance on bad faith actors, we improve energy security for all our citizens. As this forum meets today, Putin's war is in its 8th month. It shows no signs of ending soon, and that can feel daunting. But taking a broader historical view, war on the continent, once commonplace, is exceedingly rare in 21st century Europe. That is because democratic governance, free trade, and the rule of law make war unthinkable for most European countries. It's also because when Europeans get a choice, they choose peace, they choose democracy, they choose friendship. The Ukrainian people are fighting for their right to choose these values, as so many other Europeans have fought over the past century. And when Ukraine prevails, with our steadfast support, we will see a more secure, more prosperous, and more democratic Europe, and a more peaceful world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having invited me to this conference. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has put all of us at a crossroads. After 24th February 2022, we were indeed facing a choice: silently accept a blatant violation of the rule of law and of all the principles that we've been defending over decades, or close ranks with all the new friends to confront a common challenge. As EU, we choose to defend our values and principles, and we choose the way of cooperation with like-minded partners. This is why the Russian war against Ukraine has led to even stronger transatlantic links. It has also led to an enhanced EU-NATO partnership and to closer collaboration among long-standing partners around the globe. Let me underline the two main features that have marked the EU's approach since the 24th of February: coordination and unity. First, coordination with partners. European Union, United States, Canada, the UK, and other like-minded partners in close dialogue with Ukraine have been standing together and working in lockstep to support Ukraine and to defend the international rules-based order. Our political unit is rock solid. Our efforts at all levels closely coordinated, mutually complementary, and reinforced. It seems quite clear that our joint response has surprised President Putin. Second, unity. Standing united remains our greatest asset in dealing with Russia, both within Europe and across the Atlantic. In the EU, we have hosted over 5 million Ukrainian refugees. We have delivered humanitarian, economic, and military assistance to Ukraine. We have granted the country EU candidate status and imposed unprecedented sanctions against Russia. We work closely together on food security, on sanctions, and on countering false narrative. We pursue global condemnation of Russia in the UN and in other key international fora, and we will continue close coordination and cooperation with our partners to support Ukraine. We have strengthened the European Union resilience and its role on the global stage. Let me name 5 key areas where we achieved considerable progress in close cooperation with our transatlantic partners. First, strengthening security and defense. Already before the Russian war against Ukraine, EU member states had started to reinforce their cooperation on defense, including in the context of the EU's strategic compass. In the wake of the war, member states have increased their defense budgets to meet current and future challenges. Our commitment to use the European Peace Facility to finance the military support to Ukraine is the best example of our will. As long and as much as needed, we will continue supporting Ukraine. So far, 2.5 billion euros have been dispersed for military assistance. Strengthening EU defense means also strengthening NATO. And the NATO Madrid summit in June was a milestone event with key decisions concerning transatlantic security. A stronger NATO, with Finland and Sweden as new members, will make the EU stronger, and a stronger and more capable EU in security and defense will benefit NATO and our collective security. We will continue working with NATO in a spirit of complementarity. The adoption of the strategic compass by the European Union and the NATO 2022 strategic context provide a solid basis to enhance coherence and synergies between the two organizations. Our respective assessment of the strategic environments are convergent. We see each other as strategic, unique, and essential partners. This is why now is also the moment to take this strategic partnership to the next level. EU and NATO are developing a new, ambitious and comprehensive roadmap on our cooperation that should be endorsed by the end of this year. And the recently established EU-US dialogue on security and defense constitutes an important forum to discuss issues of common concern and to send a strong message of transatlantic unity. War has shown that the conventional dimension is still very important, but the disinformation, cyber, and the weaponization of policies are also playing a key role. And all this call for strengthening our resilience. This is where the European Union can play an extremely important role. Second, showing economic strength. The sanctions we adopted against Russia were unprecedented, and our decision to end our dependence on Russian energy is a game changer. The EU seeks to reduce fossil fuel consumption in the context of our net zero commitment and to eliminate our reliance on Russian fossil fuels by 2027. Both measures together will have a significant impact on the Russian economy over time. The US has shown a very forthcoming approach and willingness to help strengthen the EU's energy security. It has provided essential support, for example, by helping to increase the diversification of Europe's energy supply through LNG flows across the Atlantic. We will also work with partners across the Atlantic to advance the production and the use of clean and renewable hydrogen. The third element is the enhancement of the EU geopolitical impact. The war has polarized the international relations at a global level, and this is why, in the last 6 months, we have been tirelessly reaching out to our bilateral and multilateral partners. While we need to continue countering the Russian narrative that diverts the attention from the causes and responsibilities of its aggression against Ukraine, we also need to consider the consequences of the war on many third countries. We have to be open to this. In Africa, or more generally in what is defined as the Global South, we need to double our efforts on how to assuage the impact of the consequences of this war. China's role and its relations with Russia will be relevant not only for the further development of the ongoing crisis, but also for the future geopolitical balance in the world. For the time being, China has been cautious in the support it has given to Russia. However, the aligning of the two states may bring significant challenges in the years to come. In this context, we need to remain aware of the fact that China is a strong competitor that is promoting a political, social, and economic model that is very different from ours. We are facing a real challenging competition of models and of offers to third countries, both in the economic and the security field. And this is happening in all continents. And this is why we need to work all over the world, from Asia to Africa to Latin America, to develop offers that are solid and attractive. The fourth point is the adaptation to a changed geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape. We have to change here because the new challenges affect us all. For many years, we have worked on ideas on how to better leverage our interdependence worldwide. We took global value chains for granted, and only progressively we have understood that there are limits to this model of globalization. We have seen that big players have instrumentalized, if not weaponized, policies, for example, vaccines or energy or migration. And when policies that are supposed to link us with the world, and these policies are abused in this way, we need to make it sure that our dependencies cannot turn into vulnerabilities. And we need to make sure that the openness of our society does not become our weakness. A lot has already been done in the economic sector. The foreign direct investment screening, the economic coercion measures, CHIPS Act, the EU batteries regulation. But we need to enhance our resilience also in other areas, such as cyber or foreign information manipulation and interference. The fifth point that I would like to stress is how to take forward the technological cooperation. The green and digital transition will continue to define trade, society, and geopolitics in the 21st century. Keeping up the pace in developing new technologies will be key in this regard. And this applies to both conservatives and to new technologies. In the digital field, we have decided to open an EU office in San Francisco. We started on the 1st of September in order to strengthen digital diplomacy and to reinforce transatlantic technological cooperation. The new office will be key in strengthening transatlantic leadership in a number of areas: emerging technology standards, artificial intelligence, supply chain resilience, promoting and protecting labor rights, and addressing non-market practice and economic coercion. All issues that we are discussing with our transatlantic partners in the context of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. There is also a need to develop more opportunities for resilience and diversified supply chains. For example, via friend-shoring or allied shoring or near-shoring. We also have to ensure security of supply of raw materials, vital for the digital and green transition, and boost the diversification of imports of such critical materials. The challenges we face are also challenges that our partners in Asia have to confront. We therefore need to consider Europe, the transatlantic and the Pacific dimension as one single and inseparable security theater, and link much more transatlantic and trans-Pacific agendas. This is huge and substantial work in front of us, and this is the challenge, a common challenge that we have to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Sherman, Secretary General Sanino, for joining us at this year's forum. We are honored. To learn more about our work on democratic resilience, please go to cepa.org or follow our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and now on Instagram. CEPA's work has done a lot to highlight and amplify the voices of democracy fighters the world round. And we're delighted to be able to introduce this conversation chaired by our very own Katarzyna Pyzarska, Senior Fellow at CEPA, on how we can do our very best to support democracy fighters the world round. Over to you, Kasia.
Welcome everybody at the CEPA Forum 2022. My name is Katarzyna Pyzarska and I'm a senior fellow at CEPA, but also the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum. And it's my immense pleasure to be able today to moderate a panel of extreme importance, Democrats at Risk. And this panel is going to be chaired alongside and will be chaired with a set of incredible panelists, which I would want to welcome here today with me, starting alphabetically, first and foremost with Linas Linkevičius, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and former Minister of Defense of Lithuania, but also a member of the International Leadership Council of CEPA. Linas, it's great to have you here.
Pleasure.
The one and only Zhanna Nemtsova, who is the co-founder of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom, a freedom fighter from Russia, having been engaged for many years now in trying to bring to publics across the world information about the situation in Russia. And we are going to talk about Russia today extensively. Zhanna, it's great to have you here with us.
Thank you very much.
Also with us, Craig Newmark, who is the founder of Craig's Newmark Philanthropies and has been creating networks of people across the country. He's also a great supporter of strong democratic civil society, and we're very happy to have you here to have this discussion also, among others, on the question of disinformation. So welcome with us here, Craig.
Very glad to be here.
And last but definitely not least, Daniela Schwarzer, who is the Executive Director of Europe and Eurasia Open Society Foundation. Daniela has been for many years a renowned expert in European affairs, transatlantic international relations. She has worked for the German Council on Foreign Relations as the CEO and Director, and today she works through the Open Society Foundations in helping civil society and Democrats across the world in realizing their mission. Daniela, it's great to have you here.
Very glad to be with you today.
Fantastic. So thank you again for joining us here. We have a short, but I think a very intensive discussion, 40 minutes on the topic of Democrats and democracies at risk. So let me start with the first question that I have to you as an opening to our discussion. It is clear that for the first time, we see more people across the world living in autocracies than in democracies. The last decade has been a time of democratic recession. The moment of hope for democracy, the 1990s, is fading away in history. And it seems that even established democracies in Europe, the United States also, are really struggling to keep up with the standards, the democratic standards. Institutions are being weakened. The democratic process is being weakened. So my question to you is democracy still relevant? And if so, what can we do to push back against these autocratic tendencies that we are seeing across the spectrum everywhere we go? And Linas, if I can start with you.
Thank you, Kasia. Very complicated question, very difficult to have a short answer. But in short, of course, as directly answering your question, of course, democracies are relevant. But also it's obvious that autocracy is not giving up. And lately, especially, they're trying to reshape the world. And Russia and China, they would like to also rebuild world order, and they're making public statements about that. And we also should admit that maybe something what is happening wrong in the world. So we cannot be blamed, or West cannot be blamed, but should take responsibility, because those who have resources, those who have influence, those who have potential to make a difference, they also should share responsibility for what is happening. And this indicates the last events, starting from, well, all these crises and again, occupation of Georgia, for instance, 2008, annexation of Crimea in 2014, many other wake-up calls which were not enough to wake up for many. And now we can see that no even possibility to retreat. Basically, we came to the point when the aggressor really undermining everything what we built together, ignoring international law and undermining our lives. So those who had illusion that something happening wrong in the world, but not with them personally, now can understand that it's happening with us personally. And this is definitely something touches us all. So again, what we can do, we have to stay united, of course, but also principled. There's no possibility to retreat, especially now. And after coming back to this last events and all these threats, nuclear saber rattling, which is not first time happening, but nevertheless, all these last statements of Putin, he still believes that he can scare all of us. He can make us really hesitate, make us really stop what we're doing, especially in supporting Ukraine. And our response should be in reality, not in words, but in reality, continuous growing, enhanced support to Ukraine. And this is in short what we should do. And at the same time, just small reminder what we did wrong, I believe, in the past. when we had agreed in the European Union 5 principles in our relations with Russia, and there were sanctions and also selective engagement, but at the same time, there was also contacts with civil society, which was not happening in regular, normal way, I would say. We tried to do that, at least in Lithuania, we tried to do this, but it was not irregular, it was not the rule when it comes to general approach. And that was a big mistake. And now we can see that opposition people in Russia, for instance, some fled the country, some are in jail, and I believe this is also good to mention that Navalny 613 days in jail, more than 5 months for Kara-Murza in jail, and all those more or less visible, relevant people are basically neutralized. So we see the result. So it's a result also of our attitude, which was wrong, was not enough, not consistent. So we have to draw some lessons.
Thank you very much, Linas. You've raised the point, and this goes to Jana now, that any deterioration of democratic standards begins with trying to target civil society and the media, yes, but especially civil society. Jana, could you tell us in Russia, how the process has gone through, and what is the situation today with the mobilization of the last days and the general mobilization, which is called partial mobilization, but we know that is not true. It's going to be a general mobilization. That's obvious, with people fleeing Russia as we speak, with the last layers of civil society either being jailed or again leaving the country. What is the state today of civil society? Do you have any hope today? And how did we get here?
Thank you, Katarzyna, and everybody for having me today. To be honest, I cannot speak about anything but a full-scale mobilization in Russia. And I want to highlight that they, in reality, are going to call up 1 million people. And awful things are happening just now in Russia. People who have money are trying to leave the country. There are very long lines on the Russian-Georgian border. I think that's more or less the same on the Russian-Kazakhstan border. And airfare prices are incredibly high, etc., etc. So I think that we should focus on some major events that happened in Russia in the last decade. And the first signal, of course, in my opinion, for me, a wake-up call was the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So at that point, I realized that Putin had just crossed the red line. And that's what I told my father. I was not that much engaged in politics at that time, but I was so much shocked that I just asked my father for a meeting to warn him. He did not listen to me, and he decided to stay in Russia and was killed in 2015. So later, so it's now with the benefit of hindsight, we can say right now that Putin was preparing for this war for at least a couple of years. And in 2021, he started with a major crackdown on the media. He wanted to silence all powerful voices in Russia. So he basically all journalists and all media outlets, independent media outlets, had to relocate to other countries. There are a few journalists who are still staying in Russia and covering the situation over there, but they are freelancers and they try to disguise their connection to any independent media outlets. The same with all major human rights organizations like Over the Inform, Memorial, etc. So what Putin has achieved in this regard, he has destroyed Russian civil society institutionally. We have to understand it. It is destroyed. There are some groups outside the country who are trying to help But of course, it's not the same as it was. It's not as effective as it was when they were in Russia. And also, I would like to emphasize another thing, that the judiciary in Russia has also been destroyed. And to illustrate this, I have to just remind you that Putin's chef, Prigozhin, arrived to many penal colonies in Russia to call up prisoners. These are high security penal colonies, and I think you all know about it. So bypassing any legal procedures, any law enforcement agencies, etc., etc. What I have to say about democracy. So we are not trying to save our democracy in Russia, because we don't have any democracy in Russia, and it has been the case for many years. Russia is a dictatorship at war. But what is happening now is that, for many years, for the general public, the notion was, it's happening to someone else. It will never affect me. If I stay disengaged from politics, I will have no problems. And they believed in it until yesterday, until the 21st of September, because now it's not somebody else who is suffering. It's not somebody else who is in jail. It's not somebody else who had to leave a country. It's not somebody else who was shot dead in front of the Kremlin. It's you. And literally,
do you think that will wake up the society? Do you think that will wake up the Russian society now that?
It's a big wake-up call. You cannot imagine. It's such a big wake-up call, because I joined a lot of chats on Telegram, relocation chats, mobilization, etc., etc. Or we have border control. It has like 200,000 people there. Yes, it's a big wake-up call. And people are asking, why can't they just leave us alone? Why can't we lead our normal lives? That is why, because you have a dictator. And this is a big wake-up call. And I think people are going to understand why democracy is important, because now everybody is affected and they cannot protest. Although there were protests on the day when Putin announced mobilization. I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time only because I'm very emotional about that.
And I think this is the most important topic. So we'll be coming back to you, Zhanna, just momentarily.
Not necessarily. I'm sorry. I'm just too
definitely, Zhanna. So you made a very important point that not only the annexation of Crimea, the 24th of February, but also the recent mobilization on the 21st of September is a wake-up call for many of us, and showing that accepting dictatorships, accepting autocracy at the end of the day leads to war. But we've also, and this is to Craig directly, we've also, allowed for an internal weakening of our own democracies throughout the years. And I'm thinking here about the media space. I'm thinking here about disinformation, fake news, which led and is leading to extreme polarization within our societies. And of course, this polarization has been used, as we've seen, by malign actors. They have been, not only supporting, but often, pouring money into making sure that our societies are divided. How do you see the situation today in 2022? So it is clear that the war is a wake-up call for all, but are we actually taking the correct lessons from it? Do you see a hope, a light in the tunnel when it comes to this huge polarization caused, among others, by our media space?
I'll try to make this as brief as possible because there's so much to say. My own wake-up call related to this, not the same, 50 years ago, Vietnam, because that did turn out to be very personal. Now the situation in the U.S. is that there are very bad actors, both foreign and domestic U.S., who are working together to increase polarization in our country and to disrupt our institutions. The solutions involve exposing that disruption And there was an article about that a few days ago when it was revealed that foreign influences deliberately acted to tear apart the Women's March that was held several years ago. That was front page news on the New York Times. My theme is that I fund a lot of efforts like that to do the investigation. I'm funding a lot of related journalism efforts. For example, something that we'll see soon is affordable media lawsuit insurance for independent journalists and journalist operations. Because right now, a bad actor can disrupt an independent news operation by launching frivolous lawsuits, which will put an independent immediately out of business. Other than that, I'm funding a large network of people trying to figure out pragmatic solutions to disinformation and related cybersecurity, trying to synthesize what they're telling me. And it appears that one of the most effective ways of disrupting disinformation is to pre-bunk it, to forewarn people that it's about to happen, to inoculate people about it. And that means when something new happens, you have to articulate it in a way that doesn't give a hook for a bad actor who's looking for a fight to pick, because that is the norm in parts of US media which do not wish us well. Beyond that, frankly, I've learned one lesson from Steve Bannon. He talks about flooding the zone with shit, meaning disrupting trustworthy communications with a great deal of untrustworthy communications. My idea is to flood the zone with facts, to enlist large numbers of people to say what's true, and then to keep repeating that, and just never stop. There's more to that than that, but brevity is the soul of wit, so I'll stop now.
Thank you so much, Craig. And I think this is extremely valuable because we want to talk about concrete solutions to how we strengthen democracies, how we fight with autocracies. And I will turn directly to Daniela because Open Society Foundation is known and renowned for the fact that you have supported Democrats and democracies throughout the spectrum for many, many decades now. How do you see the situation? Of course, the situation of civil society activists in many countries have significantly deteriorated. But do you see any positive signs? Do you see areas where, you know, supporting activists really brings results? Daniela, please.
Well, thank you for that question. I think indeed, if you look at the issue on the world scale, you see a backsliding of democracy, you see authoritarianism on the rise. And the worrisome development is that it's not only in countries where this happens, but there's also a growing appetite for authoritarians to actually change the world order, the legally based international order, which I think the democracies which have existed over decades successfully have really built their existence on the openness of their economic models, the way they think about international conflict regulation, the way how we can best deal with transnational challenges that we are facing, with COVID just being one example, climate change being the even bigger one. And so if we see both at the same time, more authoritarian regimes or more autocratic regimes around the world, plus a world order which is weakening, we are not in a good situation at all, because the problems we have to worry about are not only on the national level, but really within regions and across regions, so global. But there are, and you asked for that, important positive examples to name. And the region I lead obviously has the most mature democracies in Europe within it, but also some of the toughest authoritarian regimes. But we do see that some countries, in particular, under the impression of what is happening in Russia, and that started well before the war, make really, really substantive extra efforts to continue their transition and transformation towards functioning democracies. And before the war, already many countries thought through their dependencies on Russia, and they realized that through the gas link or other vectors, they had a lot of risk in their portfolios. And right now, what we are seeing is some countries are really reviewing not only their relationship with Russia, but also the risks that close ties with China impose. And that's not to argue one should briefly simply turn away from China, but I think mature democracies and also those that are trying to move in that direction, they have to make sure that they know all the risks that they have inbuilt in their system, because what we know is autocrats and authoritarian regimes want to prevent other countries from transitioning towards democracy. And we see it in the neighborhood of Russia, how Russia is trying to stop this. I mean, Ukraine is the most brutal and horrible example, but you also see the attempts of Russia to prevent, for instance, the Republic of Moldova to move towards, fight of corruption, a more solid democratic system. They made huge progress on media freedom over the past few years. So there are positive examples, but it is a huge struggle.
Thank you, Daniela. You made a lot of important points, but one I would want to ask Linas about the fact that you're talking about the authoritarian leaders, authoritarian regimes that feel threatened by its democratic neighbors, which feel threatened by democracies. Linas, if we can explain to our audience, what is the mechanism here? Why does Putin fear democracy? Why does Lukashenko fear democracy? And how do they fight, to weaken us? And why? Because we very often assume everybody understands these mechanisms, but I often see that wider publics do not understand that at the end of the day, even if we don't feel we are at war with autocracies, they are at war with us. Linas.
In short, they're afraid to lose power. That's very simple, because in normal situation, in democratic situation, when people are free to choose, they will never live so long on power. And this means the fact why it's happening. And definitely they are trying to be quite vigilant when something spreading into the society, which is for them it's strange and not acceptable. And also trying to prevent creating kind of buffer zones, calling it as a sphere of influence or whatever. And this is happening as we speak. So I would also would like to mention Belarus, if I may, because it's also our neighborhood, but it's also part of bigger Russia. It's also happening as we speak, basically. Russia digesting this country slowly, and this country losing remainings of sovereignty and independence again as we speak. And this is also the process which we are not discussing because other problems are overshadowing. But in fact, this is really a very dangerous development. So what we can do, again, the question. So I would repeat, we have to be really united and principled and give no space, no pause for aggressors, no illusions that we can have a deal, because no deals will work. They will use these negotiations not for agreeing on something, but to have some break for recovering power and continue what they designed to do before. And this was also not learned by previous conflicts. Wake-up calls, it's interesting to discuss. Zhana told it was Crimea, but I would mention also Georgia. Occupation 20% of Georgia took place in 2008, even earlier, Was that not enough to think about something, what is happening in that century, when neighboring countries occupied and nothing happened after that? By the way, it's not only that. I would say reaction was quite proper, and statements were very concrete. It was not abstract condemnation. It was very concrete demands for Russia, what Russia has to do, but nothing happened. And again, we got back to business as usual. So that was lesson not learned, but learned by aggressor, because it looked for aggressor that price is agreeable, they can continue. And that's exactly what shouldn't be repeated today. Because if today we'll do the same, it will be really, really very bad. So coming back to Belarus, I'd like to say, as you know, we are providing refuge for opposition, for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team, and many criticizing that they are doing not enough, but at least they are spreading news about another Belarus. And the world knows that Belarus is not just Lukashenko. The world knows that those hundreds of thousands which were in the squares, in the streets during the protests, they are still alive, so to say, but they're put into prison or some opposition leaders fled, but they should be ready for changes. And we have to help them. We cannot do changes for them. I mean, in replacing them, of course, they should do their own part, both also in Russia and in Russia, not just in Belarus. But we have to help those who to give them platform for some activity and definitely preparations for the changes. So I believe that that's very important, and this is not acceptable for autocrats. They will treat that as the offensive. And to quote Putin's speech, he told that war started by Ukraine in 2014. It's not started by Russia. So who can believe? Just himself probably, and I don't know who else. But the fact is that they are treating this as offensive against them, against their way of life, model of world. Which is really undermined, but it cannot be succeeded if it will really hesitate and stop what we are doing now.
Thank you very much, Linas. Zhanna, back to you. It is obvious that we have our limits in changing countries that are authoritarian regimes. The power is really in the hands of the citizens, of the people. Do you see? You said that in Russia the last few days was a huge wake-up call, but you also said that most people are simply fleeing. Do you see any chance actually of people opposing en masse a war that's clearly being lost, and a war that, I think for the first time, is not of a small price for Putin, as Linas said it was before. The annexation of Crimea, Georgia went basically unnoticed across the world almost, and the price was very low. Now the price is much higher, and that's also changing the calculations within Russia. What do you see when you look at what people are thinking, talking? Do they blame the regime for the war, or are we not yet there?
There are too many questions in one big question. I think that the attitude toward this war is changing, of course, because once again, it's not somebody else who is affected, it's me. And people, there are cases, I know about them. I don't know on what scale it's changing, but there are cases like people initially supported the so-called special military operation. And yesterday they realized they would be called up, and then they changed their mind immediately. I think that I have to challenge here a concept that only citizens can change authoritarian regimes. I think in many cases it was not the case that actually mass protests led to regime change. In many cases it was the war that was lost, and it was the precondition for regime change in a country. So there are many historical examples. I don't know whether I need to speak about them. So that's why I keep saying that it's very important for Ukraine to win this war and for Russia to be militarily defeated, because it's gonna be the precondition for the regime change. Putin relies on his image of a strong leader for his popularity, and he claims he's a strong leader. And that's why people passively support him. And he doesn't want to lose this image, because if he chooses to surrender, he will immediately be regarded as a weak leader. And that's why I think it's one of the reasons why he decided to mobilize Russians, to mobilize Russian men. And finally, well, no, not the majority of Russians live in Russia. That's not true, just because the majority of Russians don't have travel passports. That's one thing. Second, it's completely wrong to think that the majority of Russians are leaving. The minority of Russians are leaving.
Protest. Yes, I'm sorry. The civil
you
society.
said
That's
most
what
Russians are leaving.
We're not expecting 120 million refugees anytime soon from Russia.
Okay, most Russians are staying. And despite the unprecedented scale of repression in Russia, yesterday I mean, on the 21st of September, people really took to the streets across the country. These were not mass protests, but there were protests also in Russia's biggest cities, including Moscow. People were detained, and now they use this mobilization as also a coercive measure to mobilize people. So it's a form of punishment for them. And I know those cases yesterday where people were detained and they in 2 weeks, I don't know, in 3 weeks, they will be sent to Ukraine. So once again, protests are not always a solution. We saw it in Belarus, we saw it in Venezuela, we saw it in many other countries. We saw it in Syria. And in many other countries across the world, that protests, protesting is only one tool, and not all mass protests were successful. But of course, it's important to build a bigger coalition of people, of Russians, who understand that a dictatorship is extremely dangerous and they're ready to act. So, and now it's very important that now they understand that disengagement is not a solution and it did not save them from mobilization also.
Thank you, Zhana. We move as our time is really flying to Craig. Craig, as a philanthropist, you fund networks that support not only journalism, we talked about this, especially trustworthy journalism, but you also support specific groups of people. And I was very interested in seeing you support veterans and military families, number one, and also that, of course, you support organizations advancing women in tech and media. Could you tell us more when we think about solutions on how we support Democrats across the world? Why do you choose such specific groups? What is the rationale, and what kind of lessons can we learn also outside of the United States from these kind of philanthropic activities?
Part of the solution is to support trustworthy journalism where we can, especially ones which are doing really good evidence-based reporting, like the Markup, or for that matter, Consumer Reports. Another way to help out is to provide reporters with affordable media lawsuit insurance, and also to help fund organizations which are providing free legal services to journalists. That includes media defense in the UK and a program at Yale Law in the US. The idea, though, is to keep supporting them in that regards, to support other measures for journalist security, to support work in the evolution of journalistic ethics as they have to deal more and more with disinformation. And I've engaged people to help me understand why the amplification of disinformation is wrong. I guess I always knew it because the 9th commandment says it's wrong to bear false witness. So we're trying to figure out how to get major TV networks to start challenging people when they are, well, lying to people.
And how do you do that? How do you challenge people who are lying to people?
Well, right now, for example, I am chatting with some people who say that CNN will start calling out lies. They may do that, maybe they won't do that, but if they're not doing it, I now have the networks of professionals, and the professional journalists can call that out. I do also want to support the people who defend our countries at great personal sacrifice. That's the reason I support veterans and their families. I know in the US, we owe a lot to veterans and their families. They are not treated as well as they should. So I do help them out. I help out people in other areas. And while I make a joke about it, I do support pigeon rescue, which may not be relevant today.
Well, maybe it will be, you know, if there will be an attack on critical infrastructure, who knows, maybe pigeons will be only left to help us communicate. That's a bad joke, sorry.
Yes.
For this.
Actually, my gauze are outside ready to go.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig. As we are really 3 minutes left, we have 3 minutes left to conclude the discussion. I'll leave the last word to Daniela as also a kind of summary. So, Daniela, if you could tell us, when you look at the future and when you look at the 5 to 10 years, the kind of intermediate future that we have ahead, what makes you hopeful about democracy? Let's try to finish on a positive note. So why do you think, if you were to make a case to a teenager today in a Western country, why does upholding democratic principle and democracy matter? Why should we be hopeful for democracy?
Well, my first thing would be to say, look at what is happening in authoritarian regimes. Look at Chinese COVID management. Look at what is happening in Russia now, which Sana has described to us in very, tangible terms, and compare what the system you live in as a young person in a Western, maybe liberal democracy, what you have in terms of freedom, what you can do, what you can hope for. And make up your mind which is the better place to live. But at the same time, I think we have to take the concerns, in particular of young people, very seriously, because what we need them to do is we definitely need them to engage. And what Craig just said about his way of looking at disinformation and the way he's building networks to actually fight disinformation, I think we are at a stage where we have to realize in this case, but also in other cases, you cannot just leave it to some public entity, or you cannot just leave it to a good regulatory effort, which we also need. But what we need is really a very, very broad engagement. And this concerns the question of information, of media sphere, the way we communicate, the way we assess what is true and what is not true, the credibility of information out there, which is the base of democracy. But I think it goes much further. If we look at the huge challenge that climate transition presents to also, on average, rich societies where you have groups which will suffer a lot, which will not feel they are being part of the conversation enough. If you look at the digital challenge, all this also plays out in democracies you would think today are stable. And this is why I think we need to think very different about the future socioeconomic model combined with a democratic model, which brings in new ways of engaging people in decision-making and consultation and so on. And so I think, what makes me hopeful is that I feel, although we don't have the answers ready yet, because this is a huge systemic question, more and more people are starting to think, wow, we had a model which we thought after the end of the Second World War was pretty solid and it worked. And then after 1989, which was your starting point, there seemed to be a convergence towards this model, and we took it for granted and we didn't invest in thinking, how does it actually have to change? And now with the technological revolution, transported threats and challenges, plus the rise of authoritarianism in countries neighboring democracies, I think the moment is there and very clear that this has to be a very broad political and societal conversation and a lot of engagement from all sides to reinvent the model we cherish.
Thank you so much, Daniela. I could not make a better summary and a plea on behalf of democracy. So thank you for this, and we'll see this as concluding remarks. I think the last thing we can say is that definitely the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, a war again in Europe, is a huge wake-up call. With the huge challenges it brings, it also brings, I think, a renewed understanding of what we have and what we cannot take for granted, and that is democracy. So thank you all to all our wonderful speakers, not only to today's contributions, but to the ongoing contribution that you make to making our democracies across the world stronger. And I also thank our audience today for tuning in to the conversation of the 2020 CEPA Forum. Please remember to visit our website, cepa.org, to view the entire CEPA Forum agenda and also the upcoming speakers and the recordings from the previous session of the forum. And be sure also to follow CEPA's media accounts. And thank you again. I wish you all a wonderful day and afternoon. And we hope to tune in for similar discussions very soon.
Thank you, Kasia, and thank you to our distinguished panelists, Craig, Linas, Jana, and Daniela, for joining us for today's CEPA Forum. When the war broke out, CEPA sprung into action not only through our analysis and our in-depth reporting or commentary, but we did something that we do best, which is fostering the next generation of leaders through our fellowships. The Democracy Fellowship Fund, something that you can find out on cepa.org, is really meant to be a vehicle to support the victims of Putin's war. Independent voices from Russia and Ukraine, journalists, activists, and scholars that really just want to continue to do their work. I am so honored and pleased to be introducing 3 of our Democracy Fellows, Ivan, Alina, and Olya. Over to you.
The main power of democracy is to be united and to support those who are protecting or fighting for this democracy. And as in every marathon, there is a so-called dead spot, when a large distance is behind you, but you feel out of energy. And at this exactly the crucial moment to summon up your second wind and keep on running. In this Russian invasion, it's essential for Ukraine that the West helps us keep in the race, helps us defend our land and Western democratic principles, help all of the independent voices who want to be heard.
After Russia's massive war against Ukraine, the world will not be the same. Russia perfectly understands its own actions. Having acquired the form of Asian despotism, it declared war on the collective Western world, that is not only the countries of the West, but on all those who choose the path of democracy and civilized society.
Today, Putin's Russia is a threat not only to the emergent Ukrainian democracy, but also an anti-democratic force on a global scale that has to be opposed with a broad international coalition. And I believe that independent voices from Russia have to be an important part of this coalition.
When the full-scale Russia's invasion began on February 24th, it was not only an attack on the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine, the basic democratic principles of the West were also under threat. The Russian invasion is an illegal and brutal assault on freedom, democracy, and the rule of law of the whole Western world. That is why it is crucial to every Ukrainian that every small initiative be heard and supported, as it can be developed into something powerful.
Many average citizens in the West believe that the politicians and the military will find solutions for all the issues, and everything will come back as it was earlier. It will not. Experts, media, and politicians need to realize the full scale of changes that are taking place and convey this to their voters. Sanctions against totalitarian regimes, such as the regime in Russia, do not change their policy. On the contrary, they consolidate the population on the basis of opposition to the collective enemy, which they consider to be the collective West. Therefore, the real goal of the sanctions of the democratic world is not to change the policy of totalitarian Russia, but to make it impossible for Russia to create weapons, carry out murders and destruction. Our call forecasting the actions of modern Russia is a new topic that needs efforts, funding, conferences, and setting up the transatlantic common work of the expert, media, political, and military communities.
We all have invested in this essential fight to maintain our freedom and dignity in many different ways. As a journalist, I came across many stories, such as when several volunteers started fundraising for military vehicles in Kherson Oblast, who are now helping the Ukrainian armed forces. I talk a lot about Kherson Oblast as I feel attached to this region, bordering my native Crimea. Another example is one of Ukraine's major online websites that started translating news from Ukrainian into the English language for international audiences and is now an important source for other media around the world. All of these are independent voices that started from their own initiative and now they make a difference. From what I sense and observe these days both in Ukraine and from Ukrainians temporarily displaced abroad, it's like an inspirational and uniting movement with everyone understanding that so much depends on them. And that is why it is so important that Western countries support projects that might not seem necessarily significant in the beginning, but that make a huge difference on the local level and later nationwide and hopefully worldwide.
Even though today there is this immense pressure against independent opinions and pro-democratic voices in Russia, there are still a number of NGOs, grassroots initiatives, independent politicians, people in mass media, in academia, who are ready to advocate for democracy, to oppose the regime, to oppose the war. And they do need some support today. In particular, they need support in mass media. Their voices need to be amplified, and these people need to be made more visible because they actually articulate opinions that are shared by millions, maybe tens of millions of Russians who have no political representation today. There's also a need for broader engagement of Russians in general, and especially younger Russians and more educated Russians, through integrating them.
I know that a lot has already been done and is being done for Ukraine, and I'm thankful for all your support and aid you provide to my country. And I'm excited about the opportunity that I was given with the Center for European Policy Analysis. As in every relationship, it's about getting and giving back. I believe that Ukraine will stand its ground and liberate all the temporarily occupied territories, defending national security and advance the democratic values of the Western world. And we can do it only together.
Thank you, Ivan, Alina, and Olya, for joining us today and providing us your voices. Exposing the authoritarian toolkit of influence is one of our key areas of work at CEPA. And we're just so delighted to introduce the next conversation entitled Putin's Big Fail. I will now turn it over to Paul McClary of Politico, one of our media partners for this year's forum, and encourage all of you to continue to follow the conversation by using hashtag #MeetTheMoment or going to cepa.org or following us on our social media channels. Thank you so much, and over to you, Paul.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Geisha, and thank you to our panelists. I hope everyone watching has been enjoying the event as much as I have. It's been a great series of panels this morning and yesterday as well. I'm Paul McClary from Politico, and this is Putin's Big Fail. We'll be talking about the news of the day and what we can expect next from the Kremlin and from Western allies and the Ukrainian government in prosecuting this war and seeing what's next with a mix of diplomacy, military action, and it's going to be a tough road. So with us is Anne Applebaum, staff writer for The Atlantic, Konstantin Sonin, the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor at University of Chicago, and Olga Tokaryuk, I hope I got that right, Olga, the fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I mean, the big thing everyone's talking about right now, there's a few things, but is the forced conscription of at least 300,000 Russian men into the army. If they're going to be flowed right into Ukraine, which it appears they are, and what this means for the war. Olga, if we could start with you. Clearly, this fight is personal for you. What do you think the influx of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lightly trained, lightly equipped soldiers into the conflict as winter sets in? Can this move the needle at all, do you think? Or is this just going to be a disaster for Russia as the Ukrainians keep their counteroffensive? Or what do you see happening in the fall months here?
Well, it can be both. In fact, it will still present a lot of problems for the Ukrainian army in terms of manpower. Of course, Russia is outnumbering Ukraine and sending this newly mobilized soldiers, albeit they will be ill-equipped and ill-prepared for the war, will still give an advantage to Russia. Ukraine, however, is aware of what is coming and is trying to use this window of opportunity that is still now before this huge number of newly mobilized Russian soldiers arrive to reclaim more territory. It's continuing its offensive in the eastern part of the country, and it has some troubles with an offensive in the south, but it still tries to advance. Well, the troubles are mostly connected to the fact that there is not enough artillery, not enough military equipment, not enough weapons that are coming to Ukraine from the West. Of course, this new arrivals, they will present some problems for the Ukrainian army. That is for sure. Ukraine will also probably have to mobilize more people and to send more soldiers to the front line. But the main issue still remains in terms of the struggle between the strategies, and Ukrainian military strategy so far has proved to be more efficient than the Russian one. Ukraine is not winning thanks to the sheer numbers. It's winning or it's advancing, it's counter-advancing, it's counter-attacking, it's reclaiming territory thanks to the wise strategy, thanks to more efficient planning, more efficient work of its military forces. And of course, Ukrainian soldiers are more motivated than Russian soldiers. But the crucial issue here is still the weapons. Will Ukraine receive more weapons? What kind of weapons it will receive? This will ultimately decide the outcome.
Yeah, we know there's going to be another package announced later today, 1.1 billion from the United States to Ukraine, and this isn't the things that will arrive in the next few weeks. This is the longer term financing for things like air defense and things like that. And Olga, we'll start with you quickly, and then I'll ask Anne. This is a two-pronged strategy by the United States to send equipment and munitions quickly, but also start preparing for the long haul. Are you surprised at all that there hasn't been more done, especially during these counteroffensives by the United States or the West, to get more weapons there quickly, and there seems to be more of a focus on this long-term equipping and supply?
Well, Ukraine has been repeating for months that it needs tanks, that it needs fighter jets, that it needs more air defense systems. That is starting to arrive very gradually, very slowly. Well, Ukraine was promised some more air defense systems. Well, with tanks, there are issues, and with fighter jets, this is not on the table yet. But Ukraine is continuing to stress how important is that. And I think this counteroffensive that we've seen in September, that hopefully has tipped the balance in favor of sending those weapons that maybe were not on the table, were not yet discussed as, that they would be sent in the near future to Ukraine, because exactly the US and other Ukraine's partners, they've seen that Ukrainian army is using these weapons very efficiently, that it's very capable to, even with the limited resources, to, distribute those resources and use them very efficiently. But more, of course, Ukraine is insisting that these weapons need to be sent in much larger numbers and faster.
Right. And with the forced conscription here, we've seen on social media some evidence of social unrest. It's been very localized, pretty small. Do you think that this could be something that will have a larger effect on the Putin regime if the social unrest continues or grows?
I mean, of course it could. I think there are 2 points to make about the conscription that are important. One is that this is clearly a form of the regime's war on Russia. So it's not just a war on Ukraine, it's also a war for control of Russia, for control of the small but influential nationalist movement, which wants Putin to do more, which has been egging him on to do more conscription for a while. So it's a way of satisfying them. It's clearly aimed at poorer, more provincial and ethnic minorities inside Russia. So the conscription is much wider and broader in Dagestan, which is why you've seen the protests there. And in other regions, and also very high number of Crimean Tatars apparently also being conscripted. And so in a way, the conscription is aimed at those parts of the Russian population that are both farthest away from the capital, but also maybe the most risky for the regime. So they clearly are using the conscription as part of politics, as a part of staying in control. I think the second point about it is related to what Olga was talking about a minute ago. It's very hard in some ways to understand the conscription. I mean, what's the point of sending badly trained, badly equipped men to the front line? The only way it can really be understood is that it's part of Russia's broader political plan. In other words, the idea is just to make the war last as long as possible, in order so that the West will get tired, so that Europe will peel off or break off, so that changes maybe in the U.S. politics, maybe the midterm elections. I don't know exactly what the Russians are hoping for, but they're hoping for a loss of faith or a loss of energy, and towards that end, that's what this conscription is for. That's what the nuclear threats are for. And that's what the sort of ongoing, political manipulation and political messaging in pretty much every European country and many other countries as well is aimed at. So the point of the mobilization is not entirely military in the way that we usually think of it. It's not like it's part of a strategy on the ground. It's part of a strategy of lasting longer. So they want to outlast the winter. They want to last into the spring. They want to, basically break the will of the West before their own will is broken in some way. And that seems to be the main point of it. And that's why actually I think that the more long-term language that the West uses, in other words, long-term planning for equipping the Ukrainian military 6 months from now or a year from now, while that might sound frustrating to some Ukrainians who want stuff immediately, it has a very, very useful and important, that's a very useful and important psychological message to be sending to the Russians. We're not leaving, in the next 2 months. We're not leaving in the next 6 months. We're staying there. And that's the best way, in my view, to counter this news of mobilization.
Yeah, and there's a meeting in Brussels today of several dozen nations led by the United States, the acquisition officials from each NATO country and other nations who are mapping some of that strategy out, and also how to restock domestic warehouses that were, of equipment that was sent to Russia. So there's that aspect happening too. I mean, just today, we'll find out later today what they said. Konstantin, how risky, jumping off what Anne was just saying, how risky is this strategy by Putin to call up hundreds of thousands of conscripts, even if they're coming from some of the poor regions? I mean, if they go to Ukraine, it's cold, it's wet, Ukrainians are pretty well equipped and very motivated, and start taking massive losses or surrendering en masse. I mean, how will this blow back on the Kremlin, do you think?
Okay, I do not think that this is risky for Putin. I think this is risky for these people who will be slaughtered, coming unprepared. We've already seen evidence that people who were conscripted on September 21, they were caught in Ukraine. They were lucky to be caught rather than killed in Ukraine on September 27. So I totally agree with Anna that I think this mobilization is not thought through as something important for the military exercise. This is mostly about keeping power internally, to have the country basically mobilized, to have all these people sitting in the FSB offices, Rosguardia offices, busy with now tracking conscripts and tracking all kind of anti-mobilization anti-mobilization activity. So this is the internal means of control. But otherwise, I think this is like a totally disastrous policy in terms of the economy. They're mobilizing hundreds of thousands people, at least 300,000 people already left during the last week. And although it's difficult to put just an exact number on how damaging this for the economy, but also there is no question that this is extremely damaging for the Russian economy. So like long term, this is just digging his own grave. But one thing that I want to emphasize, that every time we think that Putin plays like a 10-dimensional chess, we are mistaken. We constantly over the last years overestimate his competence and underestimate his will. So these things are stupid. They would not help him. He's digging his own grave. That's because they're like sleepwalking into a huge disaster.
And how is the West, how would you gauge the West's response, especially the Baltic states who are not taking some of these men who want to flee Russia, who don't want to be conscripted, and they say we're not taking anyone in? Do you think that's a mistake, or is that?
I think a lot of discussions about Baltic countries, they constantly ignore how small these countries are. It's like discussions of Ukraine before the war that were ignoring the fact that Ukraine is one of the largest European countries. Now people discuss Baltic countries as if they were comparable in size to, say, Poland or Germany. For Estonia or Latvia, accepting like 300 refugees, it's a big security issue. So like whatever I want for my friends in Moscow who are fleeing, I totally understand that for each of these countries, the security concerns, the logistic concerns, they come first. So I totally understand that small countries cannot accept a lot of refugees. That's actually different with Uzbekistan, which is a huge country and could easily accept tens of thousands of refugees.
Right. And is there a point where, Putin and his regime seem to be kind of backing themselves into a corner here, right? I mean, they've, someone blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in the Baltic. There's this conscription, there's some social unrest. The economy is taking a hit. At what point do you think that they would become so desperate as to do something radical, like Medvedev has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons? I mean, are there off-ramps to that point, or are we beyond that? And
I think most of what they think is based on a kind of mal-informed delusion. So like basically, they thought that they would take Kyiv in 3 days and have a military parade with Ukrainians running to welcome Putin there. The same way they think about United States and Europe, they think that United States commitment to Ukraine would waver for some reason, that Trump would win elections and miraculously remove sanctions and stop the military aid, although this is as delusional as the 3-day military operation on Kyiv. I do not see why they would use nuclear weapons. Basically, every time Putin is met with force, he folds. He has this like small criminal thuggish mentality, like attack the weak, fold when you encounter strong. So I would not expect them to use nukes. At the same time, CEPA, they're sort of delusional. If they have this delusion that the NATO army is converging on Moscow, then probably they would.
And how would you gauge the West's response, particularly NATO? I mean, it's been pretty united and solid. I mean, but so far, but you have some outliers. You have the Turkeys and Hungary, and this new far right government in Italy. We'll see what happens there. I mean, is there any risk of the West's alliance kind of shattering, maybe especially over the winter as things maybe grind down?
Okay, as always, there are a lot of things to criticize, but I think like historically, if you put this in a historical perspective, both the response of the United States government, not only Biden administration, but bipartisan, both parties, everything, and Europe, this was a stellar response. certainly a lot of lessons of the Munich 1938, they were learned. Not everything is optimal. I mean, by far not everything is optimal, but I think historically it's a much better response than, say, to Syrian crisis a couple of years ago and the previous wars, Rwanda genocide. There were a lot of historical episodes, international episodes, in which the reaction of the Western Europe and United States was much worse than this. This is a kind of, again, stellar reaction in a historical perspective.
And Anne, could you your take on that?
I agree that the overall response has been excellent. I mean, in some ways, surprisingly good. It is true that, I mean, literally within each country, you can see forces that are either pro-Russian or anti-war, or anti-Ukrainian or anti-NATO, or some combination of those three. And there will be a political battle, in which those forces play a role. That it did play a role in the Italian elections. So far, one of the decisions that Giorgia Meloni has made is to be pro-NATO and pro-Ukraine. And that was part of, portraying herself as a moderate force, but some of her government coalition partners have a different view. So, that's, as you say, still playing itself out. I mean, but if you look across the board, if you look at France, if you look at, Austria, if you look at, and of course, the United States, there is certainly a part of the Republican Party, and there's clearly a part of the Republican media establishment that remains really quite openly pro-Putin and openly anti-NATO and against this policy. And so that, you have to understand that that argument will continue to play itself out in different places. And and there will be a Russian role in that argument as well, as there always has been. I mean, some, kind of bots and trolls, and at that level, but also at the level of, there are big Russian investments in European and in maybe even American business, in media. There are, there's a kind of Russian influence game that happens on a number of levels. It's not just about information or about narratives. And that will go on mattering, particularly in the winter when gas begins to run out and energy prices are very high. Another place, obviously, to look is Moldova, where there will be a very loud pro-Russian force that will be against the government on the, and will be offering lower gas prices if they can oust the government. So that kind of argument will play itself out. So I don't want to be overly naive about that. I do think that there's been a kind of sea change, most importantly in Germany, but elsewhere. The Germans are rightly criticized for their reluctance to give certain kinds of weapons and so on. But it seems to me that there's been a mentality change that's important, in that the degree to which Europe was reliant on Russian gas and the naivete that many Europeans had about Putin's intentions in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe seems to be falling away. And it seems to be something that even the general public understands. For example, German public opinion polling is pretty good. And that's true in other countries as well. So I really feel that Putin, in a way, has whatever support he might have had before the war, he may have lost some of it simply by the sheer brutality and viciousness of this war. The bombing campaigns against civilians, the crimes against human rights, this kind of use of genocidal language and genocidal practices. I mean, I think that's, particularly in Germany, has had a really important impact. And so while I don't want to be overly optimistic about, as I said, each country has its own political battle and it will run differently in different places. Putin has lost a lot of friends or fair weather allies, people who are willing to go along with him for the sake of the business deal. A lot of that is going to be gone now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Olga, in Kiev, I mean, I know there's been, some pro-Russian parties in Ukrainian politics and figures. Obviously, one was just traded back to Russia for Ukrainian soldiers. What is the view of the West's response, and is there fear that it could begin to waver over time? The United States is already with a $40 billion package in the spring, another 11 billion, and then there's another 11 billion coming up. It's a lot of money, even for a country like the United States. Is there any fear there in Ukraine that that money will run out, or that will to spend it and the will to give up equipment will run out over time?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there is fear. Maybe it's not the correct word. There is maybe some anxiety or preoccupation, that there might be some Ukraine fatigue or war fatigue, because Ukrainians cannot afford to have war fatigue, because they are living this war every day. Every day there are news coming from the front line about someone's loved ones being killed or taken as prisoners of war. There are accounts, for horrible human rights abuses on the territories that were occupied by Russia in Kherson region, in Kharkiv region. In Kherson region is still under occupation, of course, and parts of Zaporizhia region where sham referendums were just conducted these days. So the war is very real for Ukrainians, and this issue of war fatigue is something that is very difficult to explain to a Ukrainian. How can someone in another country have a war fatigue if they didn't even experience the war? And and also the fact that it's Ukrainians who are shielding now the rest of European Union, starting from countries like Poland and Baltic states from Russian aggression, is again something that gives Ukrainians legitimacy in their demands and claims that the world does not turn away, that it continues supporting Ukraine, sending weapons, sending money, and stepping up this support. Of course, people are aware that the winter that is coming will be very tough. Of course, it will be tough for Ukrainians, many of whom will probably be left without electricity and heating. Russia already demonstrated that it's ready to bomb the objects of infrastructure, power stations, electrical plants that ensure electricity and heating, and it will continue. It will probably step up these bombings as the winter approaches. And again, and of course, the consumers in Western countries will experience the rise of prices for the electricity and heating, but still, these are not comparable things. The suffering that Ukrainians are enduring and what people in other countries might face. So so this is Ukrainians' perspective, how they see the situation, and in every occasion they will of course continue repeating that yes, you feel remote consequences, but we are paying with our lives. We are freezing, our people are getting killed, tortured, and put in prisons just for nothing. Their bodies are found in mass graves. So of course the consequences cannot be compared. So I think Ukrainians will be very firm in continuing to demand that the world steps up and does not turn away from what is happening, because it's Ukrainians who are defending the values of democracy and freedom, defending literally EU countries, but not just the EU, from further aggression by Russia. And it's from this perspective that the reaction of the West will be judged in Ukraine. And one other thing that I want to add is I think it is quite common for Ukrainians to complain that the West is too reactive in this situation, that there is a lack of proactive strategy to counter or to calculate or to predict further Russia's moves. So Russia always has the initiative. Now with this nuclear blackmail, with the explosions on the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 underwater pipelines. So it's again that Russia is escalating. It's again that Russia is making the step that forces the West to respond. So maybe something more proactive, more active actions that somehow predict Russia's next moves and counter them before they arrive is what is expected in Ukraine from Ukraine's Western partners.
Mm. And I know the French foreign ministers arrived in Kyiv yesterday, and there's been a pretty steady stream of foreign politicians and ministers of defense and heads of state heading to Kyiv. Are those? I mean, there's a symbolism there, right? But it's also a concrete commitment, at least in the near term, to Ukraine's sovereignty. How important has it been for President Zelensky to welcome those heads of state and those officials and walk the streets of Kyiv and be photographed doing that? I mean, what does that mean for the Ukrainian people? I mean, does that mean something to them that shows support or some strength or?
Well, of course, it means that, first of all, they have the courage to come to Ukraine and to visit Kyiv, because still some months ago, only politicians and leaders from Ukraine's neighboring countries were arriving, but not that many Western politicians and Western leaders. Now we're seeing more and more politicians from countries further west that are arriving to Ukraine, demonstrating support and pledging solidarity, and saying that they will, stand with Ukraine until the end. So, of course, for Ukrainian people, this is a sign, of that we are not alone, that, the world has not abandoned Ukraine, that the attention is still focused on what is happening, that Ukraine is not alone in this fight, although it's the Ukrainian soldiers who are defending not just Ukraine, but, the democracy and the values of freedom and human rights. But there is the solidarity of other countries who share the same values. So in the sense of giving a morale boost, it's of course very important.
Konstantin, the referendums that are just wrapping up in the East, have literally been done at gunpoint in some places. How is this going to play out? I mean, it seems the end game here for the Russians is to say, well, this region must be part of Russia, it's part of Russia. And if Ukraine attacks, now that becomes in their minds Russian sovereign territory, right? And that's supposed to be the red line, that Ukraine can't attack Russian territory, but it's not recognized anywhere in the West. So how does this play out? I mean, does Ukraine and the West just ignore these referendums and continue on?
Oh, I actually think that if even journalists would just ignore this, then this would be better. Like every time it's mentioned, I mean, even the word referendum is mentioned, it's not clear what is happening there, because obviously they report totally impossible numbers. The turnout numbers, they're like totally impossible. It's even difficult to say. I wrote some academic papers on election forensic. But here, I mean, you cannot even to point out the evidence of fraud, because this is just made up data. You cannot have this kind of turnout even in peacetime, given that the people are not just present there. You cannot have the turnout close to the turnout of elections in the peaceful time. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees from these regions, of people who are relocated in both in Ukraine and abroad and Russia. So this is just, I mean, this is just totally fake. It's like in my childhood, when my parents always took me to the election booth, but regardless of what we did there, the report was 99% turnout, 99% votes for the single candidate. And now what we know is that in the Soviet Union, they even did not count the votes at this time, they just reported. So I think that's what they actually do in these so-called referendums. They just report the fake numbers. They're obviously fake. I don't know who cares. I assume that they feed it to themselves, like Kiriyenko tells Putin, oh, 98% voted to join Russia, and Putin says, yes, that's what I expected, that's why we're doing this. But I mean, this is like a crazy theater for themselves. We just watch this change game, but I do not think that it should have any bearing on what people do supporting Ukraine. It should not have any bearing on what Ukrainians do.
And to continue on that point, I mean, are these sham referendums done for domestic consumption in Russia, do you think? Are they done just to give it a shot and see if anyone believes that they're true? Is the Kremlin that divorced from reality that they think something like this will gain international legitimacy? I mean, do you have a sense of why and how?
Yeah, so my understanding is they're doing this in order to annex those territories, which they'll do almost immediately afterwards, and then to claim that any attack on those territories is an attack on Russia. And the point of that, again, it's part of an intimidation game. They're attempting to scare the West with this talk of nuclear weapons. And they've said, if you an attack on Russian territory means we have to use nuclear weapons to defend Russia. So I think it's part of as I said, it's part of this huge propaganda push to get the West to withdraw or move back or stop fighting. And that's the goal of it. And then, then we're back to the question of would they really use nuclear weapons? And that depends on so many, other factors. There isn't really a way they could use them that makes sense militarily. It's not clear even that there's a way they could use them that makes sense politically. There would be a huge pushback from, not just from the West, but from China, from India, from all of Russia's other allies in the world. And it's hard to imagine how they use them in a way that helps them in this war. But the language of the referendums is very tied to that issue, and they're going to, and you'll see, as soon as they announce the annexations, they will start using nuclear language again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has kind of laid out that red line for Ukraine aid, that we're not going to supply Ukraine with anything that could launch attacks into Russia, which if you put a howitzer close enough to the border with Ukraine on the border, you could launch an attack into Russia. So this could be part of Russia trying to force that and saying, well, this is Russia now, so you can't attack. Yeah, yes. Yeah. And have you been surprised at all by the Biden administration's being so forthright about those red lines? I mean, they've had red lines about HIMARS and things like that and crossed them, but they really seem to be sticking with this no long-range artillery, no long-range rocketry.
I mean, this has been part of their messaging campaign to Russia. We'll stick to certain borderlines if you stick to other borderlines. But I think it's also the case that as the war has gone on, some things have changed. I mean, the understanding of what the Russian army is and is not capable of has changed over the last few months. The understanding of what the Russian red lines are have changed. So some of that has evolved, but I mean, I do think the Biden administration wants to be seen, as not provocative. They don't want to be blamed for provoking some even more horrific attack than the ones we have. And I understand that. I mean, I do sometimes worry that this is a kind of game with no rules. I mean, who says what is provocative and what isn't, and who's deciding what's escalatory and what isn't? It's very hard to, if during the Cold War there were some accepted signs and signals that developed over many years, and there were red telephones on people's desks and so on, we don't have that anymore, and so a lot of this is just guesswork.
Mm. And I'll pose this to all three of you. We'll start with you, Anne. Clearly, Russia's invasion of Georgia wasn't met with a strong response. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 was not met with a strong response from the West. Do you think Putin learned some lessons here and thought he could do this and not get any pushback from the West? I mean, just yet again another encroachment?
Yes, I do think that he drew a series of conclusions. I mean, from 2014, also from the invasion of Syria, the invasion of Georgia, the multiple assassinations that took place in Western capitals, the use of poison, and so on. I mean, on and on and on. There were numerous actions that were meant to test Western resolve. It's also true that the Russians, I think their view of America and their view of Europe is something they gained through, they read the far right press and they read far right media. They read the denunciations of the West as degenerate and so on. I think they believe that. And so they have a very twisted and narrow understanding of who Western politicians are and what they can and can't do. So I think it was a combination of their experience of getting away with things and their failure to understand Western politics.
Mm. And Konstantin, now that failure has been exposed and the West has pushed back, is there the ability for the Kremlin to learn here, do you think, for Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, that maybe they can't get away with this kind of behavior in the future, or is it too early to tell?
I think one of the major reasons why the war happened and these horrible things happened in Ukraine and to Russians as well, this is a result that Putin and his entourage, they were able to build a kind of an informational bubble. They are very mal-informed and in a deep sense that they do not have experts who would be able to read analytics and to translate it to policymakers. Those who were able, they were driven out of administration or learned to stay silent. There might be some people who understand and who have good intelligence, but they stay out of it. We know that Putin is continuously fed with all kind of things that just reinforce his views, what, as Anna said, this twisted view of the Western politicians. So I'm not sure that any information that is not real in the sense like your army in Kupiansk is destroyed. This is what he gets. But a larger meaning, analytics know they do not get it. They do not consult experts. They were not consulting. They fired the last experts during the war. And I think it's very difficult to get information across to them, including the information that is critical to their own decision making.
Mm-hmm. And Olga, Ukraine has been preparing for this war since 2014, right? I mean, there's been a war since 2014, and the Ukrainian government's been telling people that this is Russia, this is Putin, they're not done. Is there any, is there a sense, you think, in Ukraine that the West has finally listened and understands? I mean, clearly countries like Poland and the Baltic states have been right on board since the beginning, saying, you know, Putin's a threat. Is this, do you think, has been a tipping point for the West's view of Putin?
Well, I think it's definitely that there is better understanding of the situation in Ukraine itself and what Ukraine is and how it has been transformed in the past 8 years since 2014 than it was before this full-scale invasion, because all the analysis and predictions that the Western politicians and analysts were making before February 24th was about quick defeat of Ukraine, and you know, no one expected, or almost no one in the West expected, such a strong resistance on behalf of Ukraine. So I think there is, in terms of also understanding Ukraine, there has been a shift, more acknowledgement of Ukrainians' agency, more acknowledgement of, in fact, the strengths of Ukrainian institutions, which were perceived as, you know, very fragile, very weak, but it turned out not to be the case, and we are seeing Ukraine is resistant for more than 7 months already, and the government institutions and the public services are operating almost smoothly. You know, the railways, the pensions are being paid, and you know, the whole state apparatus is functioning. So I think not only the view and the understanding of Russia has changed in the West, but also the understanding of Ukraine and how this country has been, you know, transformed, how strong it has become, and also, of course, the resilience and determination of Ukrainian people, and this newly formed Ukrainian identity, which is very clearly now so distinct from you know, a Russian identity, from Belarusian identity, the societies that are so different now, those countries that were used to put in the same bunch so often, now it's becoming increasingly clear that it is wrong to somehow, you know, equate them or put them on in an equal, in the same bunch. So I think, yeah, there is this change of perception of Ukraine, first of all, and of course of Russia too. But I think maybe the change of perception of Russia is not happening as fast as Ukrainians would hope. And this, again, we are returning to the point that has been made today already by Konstantin and by Anne, that Russia understands the language of power, and there is still so much timidity and, you know, this belief that if we avoid escalation, then Putin will avoid escalation. You know, if we tone down, then he will tone down. But this is not what is happening, and exactly the opposite is happening. The more the West indicates that they are willing to negotiate, that they are willing to, you know, offer some de-escalation attempts, the more Putin escalates. And I think this is something that still has not, maybe this realization of the nature of this regime and how it should be dealt with. This is something that maybe in Ukraine there is more understanding of the nature of this regime than in the West. But hopefully that will be, that is changing slowly too.
Okay, and that's a great place to leave it. This has been a great conversation. I wish we could keep going, but we have to move on to the next panel. And Konstantin and Olga, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really fascinating. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you so much to Anne, Olga, and Konstantin for that wonderful discussion. A special thank you to our partners again for CEPA Forum, our media partners, Politico, Euractiv, and Defense One. A special thank you to our partners, the embassies of Czechia, Slovakia, and Romania, as well as New Strategy Center. And of course, this year's partners, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Google, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Mercedes-Benz, and Leviathan Design. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussions and for your support. Continuing on to our CEPA's bipartisan tradition, I am so very pleased to introduce U.S. Senators Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin and U.S. Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi for today's remarks. Over to you, Senators.
Hello, I'm Senator Tammy Baldwin, and I want to thank the Center for European Policy Analysis for inviting me to speak to all of you today. I am proud to join you today to talk about investing in European security. I'm a member of the U.S. Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, which plays a critical role in supporting the security of our allies around the world. In addition to other security assistance, our subcommittee has repeatedly increased authorization of presidential drawdown authority. President Biden has used that authority to distribute more than $12 billion in direct transfers of U.S. equipment to Ukrainian forces. For years, our subcommittee has also shown strong support for the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative and the Baltic Security Initiative. Funding decisions are a statement of policy, and Congress uses the power of the purse as its most powerful tool to reinforce its priorities and values. To that end, Congress has sent a strong message to Vladimir Putin that we will be supporting Ukraine's right to self-defense and sovereignty by investing in its security. We do this because it is in U.S. interests to do so, as enhanced security in places like the Baltics and the Black Sea region enables our partners and allies to be the first responders in their region with strong U.S. support. Ukraine's remarkable defense and counteroffensive without the direct involvement of U.S. troops proves this concept as effective. The war in Ukraine is most recent proof that we do not live in an economic or security bubble. Americans are feeling some economic pain from Putin's war. While I am a firm believer that the U.S. must take care of its citizens at home, Putin's efforts to weaponize energy markets and redraw borders to advance his imperialistic desires cannot go unchecked. This war has created a rare moment of international unity and given us a unique opportunity, an opportunity to critically invest in our security, economies, and cultural partnerships. We should once and for all reduce our dependency on Russian energy and instead invest in cleaner energy sources that can meet the energy needs of today. We should be investing in European security with a strategic end state in mind. We have an opportunity to assist in the formation of a capable, organic Europe defense that will allow our partners to be the first responders in their neighborhood. We can supplement this security in cost-effective ways with the presence of U.S. trainers and unique capabilities like strategic airlift and refueling, along with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support. Investing now in Europe will also allow us to focus on long-term priorities in the Indo-Pacific region without leaving a gap in capabilities in Europe. For too long, we have been trapped in the false pretense that we have an either-or choice to invest resources between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. However, as we all know in this room, the two are inextricably linked, and we can and must do both. Europe is no longer isolated from the growing presence of Chinese economic and security influence. We must rise to meet this moment so that we can collectively face the next challenge stronger. An example I often use to show the race that North America and our Atlantic allies are in against China is the sprint for dominance in quantum computing. We are in the second quantum revolution, and this has the potential to be one of the biggest security issues we have faced in generations. I would love for the US to be the sole leader in quantum computing, sensing, and networking. Unfortunately, we cannot do this alone, but together we can. Building on our current investments in Europe, European partnerships, we can collaborate with these allies to lead the world in quantum computing. Countries like Finland are already leading in certain areas of quantum innovation. And I'm excited that our focus and investment in Europe has strengthened our partnership with allies like the Finns. To address tomorrow's security challenges, we will be better served addressing them together with our European allies, because European security is an essential component of US security. Continuing these investments will provide global stability and are crucial for achieving our national security objectives. Thank you.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi. It's a privilege to address this year's flagship program. This is a unique venue for sharing ideas and strengthening our shared resolve as we work to defend the rules-based international order. With so many world events now threatening the free world, I trust that this year's forum will be a strong step toward meeting the moment we find ourselves in. As you know, our Ukrainian friends have been heroically defending their homeland for more than 6 months. They have proven themselves able defenders of their land. But perhaps even more impressively, they have rallied freedom-loving nations around the world to their cause, with NATO countries now firmly united in sending weapons to the front line. And Ukraine has used these weapons to great effect. Ukrainian troops have used Javelin missiles to take out entire columns of Russian tanks. They've used American-made missiles and drones to destroy Russian ammo depots that were previously out of striking range. On the high seas, Ukraine's defenses have effectively sidelined Russia's once formidable Black Sea fleet. And having gained momentum, we now see Ukrainian troops making a run at liberating parts of southern Ukraine. As a member of the Armed Services Committee and co-chair of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, I have had a first-hand look at the powerful and bipartisan effort Congress has put forward for Ukraine. We've authorized arms shipments ranging from ammo and drones to the now famous HIMARS rocket system. And we've coordinated with allies to ensure Finland and Sweden are able to join NATO quickly, something I've strongly supported. In addition, many of our Eastern Front NATO allies, including Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have fearlessly stepped into the breach to resupply President Zelensky and his team. These allies have done so despite the enormous risks, because they remember all too well what the iron grip of a dictator means from only a generation ago. These efforts from across the free world have had a decisive impact in stopping Putin's invaders, and we need to keep it up. In this dangerous world, it is critical that we defeat tyranny and respond with strength. Restoring deterrence will require a major rearmament program and defense buildup among all our nations. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I'm working hard to ensure that our European command has the resources it needs to deter Putin, particularly in the Baltic states. Vladimir Putin was gravely mistaken to think he could snatch Ukraine without a serious fight and without fierce opposition from the free world. In proving him wrong, in coalescing together behind Ukraine, we are restoring deterrence and laying the foundation for renewed peace in the future. Now is not the time to let up. We need to be strong and we need to be confident. Our cause, the cause of liberty and human rights, is a just cause. As President George W. Bush said in his second inaugural address, we go forward with complete confidence in the eventual triumph of freedom. I look forward to continuing our work to secure a decisive victory and the liberation of the Ukrainian people. Thank you, and please enjoy the remaining program.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin and Senator Wicker. We now turn it a little bit to China. Today, CEPA launched an interactive dashboard at cepa.org, tracking Chinese influence in the formerly known 17+1, now 14+1 and counting down countries. To talk a little bit more about what to expect next in terms of Chinese influence in Europe, we turn to our very own Edward Lucas, Senior Fellow here at CEPA, and Carrie Brown of King's College London. Over to you.
The Chinese Communist Party is the most powerful political organization in the world. And we all know that it thinks really long term and it tries to exert influence all over the world. But that doesn't make it invincible. Over the past year or so, we at CEPA have been looking at Chinese influence in the Central and East European region. And it's not a success story.
The 17+1, which was established a few years ago for Central and Eastern European countries with China, has in recent months in 2022 become the 14+1, the number of countries drifting away because of political issues with the People's Republic of China. But that doesn't mean that China is no longer relevant for the Central and Eastern European countries, and even for all those beyond the 14+1 that still remain.
People don't want to be corralled into some kind of Beijing-led beauty contest, and the awareness of the threat from China has grown along with the awareness of the threat from Russia and the need for American support. So the geopolitics is not going China's way.
So although formal arrangements like that, which was once 17+1, multilateral fora which are focused on China, at least for Europe, will become less pressing and maybe have less of a structure than they're used to and less of a reason, China's role in global affairs, because of its absolutely irrevocable input into issues like climate change and managing the global energy crisis, is going to continue. And despite the very difficult political situation between China and Europe and America, with arguments over Taiwan, Hong Kong, human rights and other issues, it's unlikely that these powers will be able to completely ignore each other. In fact, I would say it's impossible. What we're likely to see, therefore, are a kind of series of economic, environmental and energy issues which will really shape the relationship. With the energy crisis in Europe because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, China has suddenly started to figure as potentially a supplier, or at least an enabler of supplies of energy to some European countries.
The big infrastructure projects, when you scratch below the surface, are not nearly as impressive as they seem. A road to nowhere in Montenegro, a railway between Belgrade and Budapest, some of it has been built. Some attempts to have a high-tech industrial park in Belarus, but none of it really stands up to scrutiny when you look at it. And it doesn't actually matter that much from a Chinese point of view either. That's the really interesting thing. You get East European leaders such as Viktor Orban or Alexander Vucic in Serbia saying that they have this great relationship with China. But Xi Jinping and his colleagues in Beijing don't wake up every morning thinking, wow, we have this great relationship with Hungary and Serbia.
While we complain about rising inflation across Europe, we also have to recognize that trade with China has in many ways helped us to manage inflation over the last decades, simply because of being able to source more economic and cheaper goods. And China's role, despite some companies looking, for instance Foxconn, to manufacture in India and elsewhere, is still a very important manufacturing partner. We can also say that China's relations in Africa and Latin America have grown probably more compelling, and they are not part of the sanctions that are against Russia and create an almost alternative world, the dual track world as it were. The one outcome that I am confident we won't see is China not having a role, and that is the way in which we shall be able to understand future scenarios. The least possible is China not being there. The most possible is China will be there in particular places and may be there in more dominant ways than we are probably ready to appreciate, but it will certainly have a role to play.
So it's not quite a nothing burger. It's something to watch out for, and there is opportunity for China there, particularly when the West makes mistakes on things like COVID vaccines. That's where China gets some points in. But in the end, the story of the last 10, 12 years of Chinese influence in Eastern Europe is a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money, and not that much result.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Carrie. To find out more about CEPA's work on China, go to cepa.org to find in-country reports and our recently launched interactive online dashboard. And now we turn it back to Russia and Putin's war in Ukraine. I am so delighted and honored to welcome Undersecretary of the Treasury, Brian Nelson, in conversation with our very own Sam Green, Director of our Democratic Resilience Program, for a conversation on sanctions and what's next in terms of the transatlantic partnership. Over to you, Sam.
Hello, it is an honor and a pleasure to welcome Brian Nelson, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, to this fireside chat as part of the 2022 CEPA Forum. My name is Sam Green. I'm Director of the Democratic Resilience Program here at CEPA. And we're going to talk a little bit about sanctions, what's made sanctions effective and how they may remain effective going forward. So thank you very much, Undersecretary Nelson, for joining us today. Undersecretary Nelson, it is a difficult and a challenging, but I think also an important time to be talking about what we're going to be discussing today. We are, 7 months now into sanctions, really quite sweeping and in many ways unprecedented sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, incurred by its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Of course, we are, more than 8 years now into the sanctions that were incurred by Russia after its initial intervention into Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. So it's an important time, I think, to look back. I know as the department has been at what we've learned about what makes sanctions effective and what allows them to achieve the government's aims.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to CEPA. I hope it'll be a really powerful conference. And going directly to your point, it is such an important moment for Europe, for the United States, and obviously, frankly, for the world. And one of the unprecedented nature of the sanctions, obviously, that we in 30 countries have taken against Russia really reflected in sort of their scope. So 1,200 designations just from the United States, but as you noted, really from a Department of Treasury perspective, rooted in a lot of the inherent knowledge from that 2014 reaction to Crimea. Our Deputy Secretary was here at the time, as well as our Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Finance and Financial Crimes, Elizabeth Rosenberg. So they had sort of that historical knowledge and know-how going into this moment. And I think that was also informed by this sanctions review that the Treasury Department undertook last year, just before I was arriving. And one of the, I think, critical features and outputs of that review was an acknowledgement that our sanctions are really most powerful when undertaken multilaterally. And so I think that reflection came out so strongly in the course of the review. Obviously, a review that was not only about the Treasury Department and its administration of these sanctions authorities, but really how our entire government should think about the use of this tool. So it was timely in the sense that obviously that was happening just as we were beginning to understand that Russia was seriously thinking about further invading Ukraine. And I think those two things coming together, sort of the emphasis and focus on and understanding that importance of multilateralism, really led to a whole government effort to engage our partners on what the reaction, the global reaction would and should be, should Russia make the wrong decision to further invade Ukraine. And this was significant in the sense that those early interactions really helped us do a number of things. One, identify how Russia relies on Western financial system, both from a sort of a revenues perspective, but also even just in terms of exports, sort of what are the critical imports that Russia receives from us, from Europe and our other allies and partners. And knowing that information ahead of time helped to make the rollout and execution of our sanctions obviously much, much more effective. And then similarly, that engagement at the beginning has helped us identify ways in which Russia is trying to evade Western financial tools and the international financial system. So in understanding sort of the tools and techniques and ways in which Russia has tried to avoid these touch points, that has also helped us collectively think about ways through the Russia Elite Proxies and Oligarch Repo Task Force and other tools to think about how we can best go after evasion of our sanctions. So I think that early cooperation, insofar it has also allowed us to obviously freeze about half Russia's sovereign assets and obviously the lead up to Russia's evasion, and then take a number of actions that have relied heavily on partners and allies, has just made the execution of this far more effective. Ultimately, with the strategic goal, obviously, of limiting Russia's ability to continue to prosecute this war against Ukraine and degrading its ability to project power into the future.
You mentioned lessons learned, and I'll come back to the sanctions review from 2021 in a moment, right? Clearly the sanctions from 2014 did have an important impact on Russia's economy, on its place in the world, on its ability to pursue its aims, and really on the costs that it faced as a result of what it was doing in Ukraine. We could also think about incidences ranging from the 2016 elections to the attack on Mr. Skripal in Salisbury in the UK, and the shooting down of MH17. In the end, ultimately, the sanctions didn't deter Russia from doing what it did in 2022. Should we be more confident about the impact of the much deeper and broader sanctions that had been brought in since 2022, since February of just this year, in terms of the impact on the Russian economy and its war effort?
Yeah, no, I think we should be confident. I think for a number of reasons. One, obviously, sort of the global coalition that we have really formulated in supporting Ukraine through our sanctions, but obviously through a number of other means. So, with the idea that at the heart of this is to provide Ukraine with the support it needs to continue to defend itself and create that space to be able to do so. And I think we are on the sanctions side and the export control side seeing that in a number of ways. I mean, one, we anticipate the Russian economy is going to contract pretty significantly this year. I think we estimate about 6% and continue to envision further contraction into the future. We've seen in terms of imports from the United States, those have fallen by 97% just over these last months. And I think globally, the number is close to 30%. We're certainly on the sort of the material, sort of the tanks, the airplanes, the submarines, the things that they need in order to continue to prosecute this war successfully against Ukraine. The sort of the key inputs to those things we have restricted. So we're seeing that as a result of that, their sort of semiconductor and manufacturers are either having to shut down or pause production. We're seeing that they are sort of stealing from Peter to pay Paul in a way, taking parts from commercial equipment in order to, as best they can, facilitate their use in military equipment, but that can only last for so long, and the signs of those struggles are really apparent already. And then I think ultimately what we would expect is those problems will continue to compound over time, and we're already, of course, seeing that in terms of the backfill. They're having to rely on places like Iran and North Korea, which obviously the sort of the quality and even the quantity of that type of military defense material is not going to be sufficient for them to be able to continue to prosecute this war forever. So I think we are really seeing that degradation happening both economically and in terms of their ability to prosecute this war effort.
Another thing, of course, that the sanctions review mentioned, which you already drew some attention to, is the importance of multilateralism, both in achieving the aims of specific sanctions, but also, I think, in just maintaining the sharpness of the sanctions tool, right? The role of the dollar in particular. I think one of the most remarkable aspects of the sanctions regime since February 24th has been its multilateral nature, right? It's the leadership of this. Clearly, there have been times when Washington's been out front, other times when London, Berlin, and Brussels have been out front. Can you shed any light into what has made that so successful?
Well, I think a couple of things. It really, I think one, the information sharing and that ability to trace financial networks that are critical to the sort of the strategic goal of limiting Russian revenue going forward, and obviously limiting the sort of the key supplies they need to continue to prosecute the war. And those things come from us, they come from through Europe systems, through Japan. And I think the ability to come together and understand those things have been essential in this effort. And I think through this REPO, this Russian elites, proxies, and oligarchs task force that are all the G7 members and the European Commission, we will be able to continue to share that information, continue to work to align our tools to make sure that we are effectively using our sanctions authorities. I think one of the things that we're looking to do going forward is to think together about our authorities to seize and freeze and otherwise restrict and immobilize Russian assets. And they've already, I think, as has been reported, we've immobilized $30 billion worth of Russian assets collectively. So I think that work, again, if we can continue to do that in a way that limits sanctions evasion, we will continue to see sort of these compounding effects both on Russia's economy and then also on the sort of the stuff, the material they need to continue to prosecute the war. And that is really, I think, unprecedented, and that sort of the unprecedented nature reflects obviously the size of Russia's economy. And one of the things that we have been really focused on in that context is providing strong economic analysis in support of this effort. And again, I think the size of Russia's economy and the demand signal from our partners has really required us to really prioritize that type of investment as well, which was also reflected in the sanctions review. But we, given the size of the economy, we're really seeing the need to increase an investment in those types of tools here within the Treasury Department as well. So I think all of those things, have reflected both well on the pre-thinking that went into the review, but we've been able to, unfortunately, sort of live those policy prescriptions through this joint effort with our allies and partners.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned sort of the resiliency of that transatlantic effort and that solidarity. Obviously, it's a cliche, but winter is coming. Obviously, in Europe, something that a lot of people are feeling very strongly about. We've seen the Hungarians just today, raise questions about, the next package of EU sanctions. Maintaining this obviously requires not just a focus on sanctions, right, but on how we mitigate impacts on our own economies. Do you feel that there is sufficient dialogue and resources and understanding of this available to you as you try to shape a sanctions agenda that will be effective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and observation. And I think, a couple of things. One, it goes back to that point of the need for strong economic analysis so that we can go in collectively and really in lockstep understanding that what the impacts are going to be on our respective economies based on the actions that we are collectively taking with our partners and allies, and really under the principle that the impact to Russia should be greater than obviously the impact on the rest of the world. So that is a principle that we've been able to carry into our conversations with partners and allies, but to your point, really needs to be a resource so that we are fully appreciating sort of the full waterfront of the impacts that we're having and all of the actions that we're taking. I think second, we've seen Europe in particular already take hard decisions. I mean, the sixth package, the decision to ban EU or Russian oil at the end of this year and refined products at the beginning of the next is a significant decision that has already been taken, is really as significant as you can sort of imagine. So in terms of the resiliency of our partnership, I think both because it's been effective, and sort of rooted in the understanding of the shared strategic goal to limit Russia's ability to continue to prosecute this war and project power into the future. I also think we have seen that we have been able to collectively talk about sort of the pain, the impacts to our economies collectively that are coming. And Europe is obviously more integrated with Russia and Russia's economy than the United States is. So appreciating that they're going to experience some of those impacts even more so than our own economy. And it's really, one of the reasons why we here with our partners in Europe have been so focused on, as part of the European six sanctions package, identifying a price exception associated with the ban on services in support of Russian seaborne oil. And really that work is designed to limit the shock to energy prices in the global economy. Obviously, Europe and the United States won't be buying Russian oil, but by creating this price exception, the hope is to keep Russian oil flowing while limiting Russian revenue, with the goal of obviously, therefore, decreasing the upward pressure on energy prices globally and creating a market access to markets by low-income economies in Asia and North America, in South America and Africa.
Indeed. Obviously, we could keep this conversation going for some time, but you have
talk about it all day. Yeah.
You have the task of actually making policy and not just talking about it with people like me. Nevertheless, I'm extremely grateful that you've been able to share some time with me and with all of us here at the 2022 CEPA Forum. This has been a fireside chat with U.S. Department of Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Brian Nelson. Undersecretary Nelson, thank you very much, and best of luck.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and have a great conference.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Undersecretary Nelson. It is now my honor to introduce the 2022 Freedom Fighter Award. In previous years, CEPA has been honored to bestow this award on Linas Linkevičius of Lithuania and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, leader of Democratic Belarus. This year, undeniably, the Freedom Fighter Award goes to the fighters in Ukraine. To introduce the award, our very own Ambassador Kurt Volker. Over to you, Kurt.
Hello, my name is Kurt Volker. I am a distinguished fellow here at the Center for European Policy Analysis. The people of Ukraine have inspired all of us this year with their resolve, their determination, their skill, and their success in defending their homeland, their families, their houses, their territory, their livelihood against Putin's unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. They have pulled together in so many ways. Doesn't matter if they are native Russian speakers or native Ukrainian speakers, men or women, young or old, Kyiv or the countryside. The whole nation has pulled together to defend Ukraine as a country, to defend the identity of being Ukrainian, something that Vladimir Putin sought to extinguish. They've done it in so many ways. They have strengthened the regular army and armed forces. Conscripts have come in. People who in their normal lives are factory workers, teachers, electricians, any walk of life you can imagine, enter the armed forces to help save and defend the country. They've formed territorial defense forces, city defense forces, legions of people on their own organizing to deliver humanitarian assistance to those who need it in the country, keeping the economy going, even as they face this terrible onslaught from Russia. It has been an inspiration for all of us. Ukraine is defending freedom on the frontiers for all of Europe. It is not just about saving Ukraine. It is also about defeating imperialism and fascism in Europe and protecting freedom for all of Europe. And for that reason, CEPA is proud to award its 2022 Freedom Fighter Award to the fighters of Ukraine, all of the Ukrainians who have pulled together to defend freedom against Vladimir Putin's attacks. This award is for you. And to accept the award on their behalf is none other than Defense Minister of Ukraine, Alexei Reznikov.
Minister Reznikov didn't enter politics as a wartime leader. He was a lawyer. He had served in the private sector and came into the Zelensky administration, attempting first to try to make sense out of the Minsk agreements and see whether there was a way to implement them and improve them so that there would be lasting peace in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, of course, had other plans and launched his deadly assaults again against Ukraine in February of this year. And Minister Reznikov has shown extraordinary leadership in providing everything for the Ukrainian armed forces that they need to defend their country, and most of all, providing strong, clear, moral leadership alongside President Zelensky. And so here to accept this award on behalf of the fighters of Ukraine is Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov.
Dear friends, it is a great honor for me to accept the Center for European Policy Analysis Award as a sign of acknowledgement for the efforts of all Ukrainians, of our defenders, the men and women protecting Europe from the Russian aggression, of the entire Ukrainian nation. The nation that is paying a staggering price for its freedom and is demonstrating its steadfast and unbreakable dedication to its choice. Ukrainians chose freedom over tyranny 32 years ago. In the years that followed, the Ukrainian statehood grew stronger as our democracy developed. In 2004, Ukrainians rose up against an attempt to bring the nation back under the yoke for the first time. Back then, the opponents wanted to rob us of our right of free elections. I remember those days well. I was the lawyer of the Democratic presidential candidate Viktor Yushchenko. After all, we won first in court and then at polling stations. 10 years later, Ukrainians took to the streets in a peaceful protest again. They protested against the Russian agents in power that tried to sweep away our European and Euro-Atlantic choice, steering Ukraine into the Kremlin's lap. Then came the war that isn't over to these days. Tens of thousands of our citizens have been killed by Russians. Hundreds of our cities, towns, and villages have been damaged. The Russian occupiers have razed some cities to the ground, but we didn't break. This winter, many respected figures believed that Kyiv would be captured within 3 days and that the whole of Ukraine would fall within a couple of weeks. We have been holding strong for more than 200 days now. With Western help, our army has crushed the myth that the Russian army was the second most powerful military in the world. That army is fleeing. It is being defeated by the very people who didn't have HIMARS or 155mm caliber artillery when the full-scale invasion began. These are the very same people who we called to arms in late February. They choose to fight for their home and their loved ones. In Kyiv alone, we gave the volunteers more than 20 guns within 2 days, because Ukrainians will never surrender again. We have learned our lessons. We will never allow another Holodomor, a man-made genocidal famine. We will never allow another round of repressions against the best minds of our nation. Now the Ukrainian nation is fighting for true independence with arms in hand. But this is not just our fight. This is the battle for the foundational values of the free world. This is the battle for who gets to dictate the new world order. Is it the tyrants? or is it democracies? Every institution established after World War II to prevent future wars, the UN, the OSCE, and others have failed. This war decides who will get to write the new rules for the entire world. Europe, America, and everybody who wants to live in the world based on the rule of law, the world that respects human rights and freedoms and has no room for terror, genocide, or subjugation of entire nations, have to support Ukraine now. If we fall, every power that aspires to reach its goals through acts of aggression will celebrate Russia's victory. They are making no secret of that. Ukrainians have proven that we can fight and we are ready to win. But we need weapons. These weapons will help to strengthen Europe's and NATO's eastern border. I call on everyone who is now celebrating the Ukrainians' fight for freedom to help us get weapons. The only road to peace is our victory, after all. I would like to express my gratitude to the Center for European Policy Analysis once again and wish you every success in your mission. Thank you very much, and Slava Ukraini!
Congratulations once again to the 2022 Freedom Fighter awardees, the fighters of Ukraine. And thank you so much, Defense Minister Reznikov, for joining us and accepting the award. Slava Ukraina. That's a wrap for day 2 of CEPA Forum. Thank you very much to our partners, Google, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Mercedes-Benz, and Leviathan Design. A special thank you to our partners, the embassies of Czechia, Slovakia, and Romania, as well as News Strategy Center. And of course, to our media partners, Euractiv, Defense One, and Political. Thank you so very much for joining us. Stay tuned for day 2 tomorrow of CEPA Forum, and thank you for joining us. Please be sure to continue to use hashtag #MeetTheMoment to continue the conversation, and go to cepa.org to find out more about our work, including videos from today's presentations. Thank you very much.
The strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people has illustrated the importance of America's investments in and commitments to European security.
Even though maybe the EU is further advanced in terms of regulation than the US is, for reasons which I think we all know, in terms of the problem analysis, I think we see largely eye to eye.
When the shooting stops, the war won't be over. Ukraine must win the peace as well as the war.